So Stephen Dale is a disability rights advocate whose interest in the disability community began at an early age. He comes from a family of institutional workers that served in California state hospitals and developmental centers for over 3 generations. Stephen worked for 17 years as a psychiatric technician in a variety of institutions in California, and later became an intern at Disability Rights Education and Defense Fund, working on disability access cases before starting his own practice focused on drafting and administering special needs trusts. He is the recipient of the 2010 Teresa Foundation Award and the 2007 Naila Powley Award. Additionally, Mr. Dale is a longstanding member of the Special Needs Alliance, a national nonprofit organization of attorneys dedicated to the practice of disability and public benefits law. Everyone, please welcome Stephen. Quietly or loudly.
So anyway, Frank invited me to do this, and I do a lot of public speaking, but I feel like I'm on a trapeze without a net here. So hopefully this doesn't go terribly wrong. And like I say, the only reason I've got the PowerPoint is that I have no intention of talking about public benefits or that kind of thing. But my understanding is I'm going to talk about how did I get into this, and also, I like to describe myself as the Forrest Gump of disability rights. A lot of the things I was involved in, I didn't write the ADA, but I was there. I didn't write IDA, but being in the East Bay, is a lot of disability rights started right here. And just because of happenstance, I've had, I think, a fairly interesting experience here. So part of what I was gonna, if I can make this work, let's see if I can do this. Okay. Yeah, we're talking about the future. We'll start off. How did I get involved in this? So like it said in the bio, which I horribly need to have rewritten here, I come from 3 generations of institutional workers. So my father here, who is sitting with the open shirt there. My father worked as what's called a psych tech for 40 years here, and he worked in all sorts of different institutions. The fellow holding the baby, that's my grandfather, who worked in institutions for 35 years. The guy with the mustache, that's me. I worked for 17 years in a number of institutions, some good, some horrible, and that sort of thing. That anybody fellow down there, he's 40-some years old now, and he did not follow the family tradition here. He did not work in institutions. And by the way, as I go through this, I have a fondness for institutions, but do I think we should return to state hospitals? Absolutely not. That's, the thing that, and I sent some materials to Frank. I don't know if they're going to be passed out. I don't know if there's much interest, but, there's a article I wrote called the Olive Green Notebook, which a lot of what I do and what I've been involved in my entire life is, in fact, my family is getting people stuff, getting people the stuff that they need here. And so, for instance, in institutions, if you're looking at how you're going to get people stuff, there's probably no more efficient way of doing it than, just housing everybody in big buildings out here. That is real easy to figure out what they need and how to get it to them. Here, it's not the way we choose to live and that kind of thing, but it certainly is efficient here. And so part of kind of my story, how I got involved in this, we'll just go back, is that, when I was born into this family, it was real common back in my father's and grandfather's day that staff would bring their kids to work here. And it was not unusual that for periods of time, you'd actually live on the ground. So I spent much of my life when I was young. I was born in San Jose, California, here, where we would actually live on the grounds of the state hospital, which just seemed absolutely natural to me. I thought everybody lived in the state hospital. I was kind of shocked to find years later that's not how it rolls here. And part of that was I used to spend a lot of time on the units, and I used to spend a lot of time following my grandfather around because, well, what else was I going to do? And absolutely adored him. Part of the the background of this is in the late 50s, here was in early 60s was a change in how the institutions were run. So prior, California's had institutions for years, and they were work farms here. And there's a thing called the cottage system. So the vast majority of you didn't even call them patients back then, but the folks that lived there, they were mentally ill, and they would basically come and go, but they would live in a cottage system, and they would work the farms here. And so sometimes they were there all the time. Sometimes they went in and out. But basically it was an asylum in a total sense of the word. And so folks would come and all that. So in the 50s and 60s was the advent of psychotropic medication. I mean, if you think about it, before those days, before they had medication, you really couldn't warehouse people because, well, they doing that is a very difficult thing to do, and it wasn't really even productive. But then we went, and this is in my father's day, there was a move towards moving to a medical model in the institutions, and also looking at mental illness and developmental disabilities to a degree as a medical issue. Okay. And with that was the advent of phenothiazines, which is the medications that they have a lot of benefits here, in that they can help folks that have psychotic disorders and that kind of thing to be able to control them. On the other hand, chemically, they're very similar to Benadryl. If you've ever known anybody who's taken a psychotropic medication, a lot of the side effects are the same. So if you've ever had one too many Benadryl, just imagine just taking gobs and gobs of that stuff. I mean, once again, you'll never have the local drug dealer come up and say, "Hey, I got some hot Thorazine here." I mean, there's no street value. They're not feel-good drugs. But the other thing that with the advent of phenothiazines was that you could start warehousing people, and things started moving towards the warehouse model here, away from the farm model. And also, once again, California being, usually first in some of the most wonderful things in the world and some of the most horrific. My father worked a post-lobotomy unit, it's where they figured out, oh, well, we can just cut mental illness right out of your head. And that didn't actually work out very well. Seemed like a good idea apparently at the time, but that's, just not something we would do. But through that, in the 60s began the deinstitutionalization model, which is basically, a lot of it came from developmental disabilities, which we would call mental retardation, but we don't use the R word anymore. But through, there began to be a deinstitutionalization movement here, which was basically a movement to shut down the institutions in favor of community programs. Let me see if I've got it. So part of that was, as they worked on the deinstitutionalization movement, early days here for mental health, there was a ton of money thrown into mental health. Most of you guys are probably too young, but for those of us that are older, there used to be all sorts of ads on TV about mental health. There were all sorts of programs. My father actually worked helping set up community programs all over the state, and they just flourished. Okay. But like many things, the funding started lagging. And today, for mental health, I think that we have one of the worst mental health systems in the state. It's absolutely disgusting here. And so right now, our mental health services in California are pretty much easy to identify because there virtually are none, right? I mean, most of the mental health programs we have are underfunded, and we don't have the housing programs for folks and that sort of thing. But that was part of the problem with the deinstitutionalization movement, because a lot of this was done on the promise that we would fund all these programs, which they did, and then they defunded them, which unfortunately happens all the time. For developmental disabilities, it went quite the opposite direction, because in the early days of deinstitutionalization, There wasn't even an interest in developmental disabilities, but that was really more of a grassroots movement, mostly of parents here who started asking questions. Do I really have to put my kid with Down syndrome away? And so one of the, I write short articles. One of the articles I sent that if you guys get a chance to read it is called "The Baby in the Basket." And it describes, like, if you had a kid with Down syndrome, it used to be that, geez, there's a pretty good chance that my grandfather might show up with a basket. And what you do with the basket is you put the baby in the basket, and then they would take the baby to the institution because, of course, we know that we can't start having disabled people living in the community. What kind of world is that going to be here? And that was kind of the thinking at the time. And there were parents who started asking questions. Well, is that really necessary? So a lot of the institutionalization movement started mostly in basements of churches, of all things, with parents who would try to get their kids into school programs, and the schools would resist. And then they would start their own little schools, almost always in the basement of a church. And then as time went on, there was a lot of advocacy around that. And that's where IDEA and all the special ed programs started up. And then there was a thing called the Lanterman Act that came up where, once again, funding programs to move people out of institutions into the community. And that's where in California, we have probably one of the best programs for developmental disabilities in the country, because there is a guarantee of services. Sometimes they're kind of mediocre, but at least they're services here. Whereas with mental health, there's no guarantee of anything. It's really kind of a difficult area. One of the things that this slide is about is one of the articles I sent you is called the Olive Green Notebook. And what I kind of describe in that is, in my father's and grandfather's day, the way they would figure out what people need is they would keep these notebooks, and they did them methodically the same way for 100 years, maybe little or no change on how they did it, and basically could keep track of how much milk you needed and how much bread you needed and that kind of thing. The challenge now is with community living is the job is the same. How do you get people what they need? But it's a little harder in the community because it's kind of a fragmented system, partially by design. I mean, if you think about it, but it's a real challenge. And, once again, we have systems in California that have really excelled, especially in the Bay Area. In the Oakland area, we have what's called the Regional Center of the East Bay. It has its problems, I can guarantee you, if you're a family member that deals with them. But when you look at programs across the country, once again, there's a guarantee of services there, which is something that's very rare when you're dealing with disabilities. Kind of going a little further as to how I got involved in this. Like I told you, I'm kind of doing this without a net. Going back to myself and, what I saw and how I saw it. When I grew up, I absolutely had determined there was no way I was going to work in a state hospital. That's not going to happen here. But they had this program that if you went and got your nursing degree, they would pay for your education. And I thought, well, that sounds kind of cool. I'll do it. And then I just will work for a year and get the hell out of here. Well, I did get my nursing degree and started working on what are called forensic units, basically units. I used to be in very, very good shape. And I worked on what's called the bullpen here. It's for folks with, well, these were mostly murderers who, were mentally ill and that sort of thing. And there's kind of an art to doing that kind of work. And it was kind of one of the last programs like itself. I went from there to Napa State Hospital because I'm a Northern Californian at heart. And the program I was in San Bernardino, which I have no use for. I am definitely a Northern Californian. And so I got an opportunity to go to Napa State Hospital, and I worked in a number of good units, but then I worked on one unit there where I did something that's not really good for your career. I turned in a fellow staff member for abuse, and then I did it a second time, which is not a good career move, just here to tell you. here, and finally ended up leaving the state hospital system and decided, well, I'd like to be an attorney, not for any particular reason. Quite frankly, I went to a law school of no repute whatsoever, where basically anybody could get in. So they definitely accepted me, but it was a way to get out of the hospital. And lo and behold, to my amazement, I actually passed the bar, which was a shock to me here. But while I was there, I interned at a place called the Disability Rights Education and Defense Fund. So, which is in Berkeley, and the Disability Rights Education and Defense Fund, that would have been in the mid 80s, was the leading disability rights organization in the country. They basically wrote the ADA here, and IDEA. Those are the basic programs. They were very involved. There's a great program, if you haven't seen it, Crip Camp with Judy Heumann, which I had the privilege of being a host with a group with her. I mean, she's one of about a half a dozen icons in the disability community, and they all came from the Oakland, Berkeley area. And she was involved in the 504 protests and that kind of thing, where basically a bunch of quadriplegics took over a federal building, and quite frankly, they couldn't figure out what to do with them, because what do you do, arrest them? And when I worked at DREDF, one of my jobs was that if they were dumb enough to arrest one of these folks, since I was a former nurse, my job was to go down to Santa Rita and bail them out and make sure that they're safe. Anyway, I met a number of different folks, but and just as an aside, I also had a background in doing media a long time ago. So when I was working for DREDF, they had a special program for attorneys who wanted to do disability access law, which is what I wanted to do, which is helping to make sure that buildings are accessible and that sort of thing. And I asked the head attorney, could I record these things, because then we could use it for something else. So these were done at Bolt Hall. So I was sitting in Bolt Hall with my camera all set, I'm ready to go. And somebody brings this big contraption in a wheelchair, and it's got a respirator, and it was kind of like Darth Vader with the sound, the breathing sound on. I'm just going, this is terrible for my camera. And I said, will somebody get that out of my way? And that was Ed Roberts. That was the first time I met Ed Roberts here. So that contraption was actually Ed, which, changed my life. And so the interesting thing with it is that, he was very connected with DREDF. He was one of the founders for the Center for Independent Living. He founded the World Institute on Disabilities. I mean, just about everything, he had his fingerprint on it here. And for some reason, he took an interest in me. And we used to spend a lot of time together. And Ed always challenged a lot of my thinking, because my thinking was, when I left the state hospital, I was going to, take all this knowledge I have and, teach disabled people, all sorts of stuff. And Ed pretty much convinced me to screw that. He's not the least bit interested in that kind of thing. Who in the hell do I think I am? And, once again, I'd never worked with a person with a disability who was my equal, much less he became my mentor, and pretty much taught me about how not to look at folks with disabilities as objects of my compassion, because quite frankly, they don't need that kind of thing, but just basically, how to relate to folks with disabilities as people, which is most of what folks are looking for. And so, once again, was fortunate enough to have a lot of involvement with Ed. What actually happened was, when I went to law school, I'm a little hesitant to say this because I know somebody here, but when I went to law school, I actually recently shredded my law school grades, because wills and trusts and taxes, absolutely under no circumstances am I going to do that kind of thing. I'm going to be a civil rights lawyer, and bring down the institutions. Well, my directing attorney came to me one day and said we used to get pretty large settlements for people and they would immediately lose their public benefits. And my directing attorney came to me and said, we need somebody. I went to a CEB class on special needs trust. Never heard of these things before. And Steve, I decided that you're going to learn how to do this. I said, Sid, there's no way I'm going to do this. And lo and behold, got involved in it and found that it was an area that I really enjoyed, partially because you go back to community living and that kind of thing. Things are not hunky-dory in the community. I'm just here to tell you here. It's really challenging for folks with disabilities, especially with what's been going on lately and a lot of the funding issues and that sort of thing, to get services and quality services and services you can count on here. And the other part of that is that I came to an appreciation, good and bad, about public benefits, because oftentimes a lot of the programs that are necessary for these people to live, they need to qualify for basically a welfare program. And there's a good part and a bad part to that. There's a necessary part to it here. But on the other hand, when they started the deinstitutionalization movement, which you can trace back to President Kennedy, he didn't say, let's move everybody out of the institutions and put them on welfare programs. I missed that part. That was something that was done years later. And so the systems that we have for providing services are really challenging. And the other thing is they are incredibly complex. And the problem that you run into that is just being able to secure those services long-term, to get the quality services. There really is no care management and oversight about how that's done. That's something that families, persons with disabilities, parents end up learning here, how to, and I don't mean this pejoratively, basically work the system. It's not something that is intuitive. And I think that's one of the reasons why there's so many people that are mentally ill that just have no services, because trying to work within the system is just mind-boggling. Like to say, I'm considered a national expert, and this stuff confuses the hell out of me. And just imagine if you have somebody who is with autism or mental illness or even a physical disability with limitations, trying to get through that system is just a mind-boggling process here. It's a full-time job just to do that. So, once again, to leave some time, a lot of what I do is I work with families. I also donate a tremendous amount of time here to systems here, but to how to set up systems to manage or provide for somebody for their disability, like a disabled loved one, or folks who get personal injury settlements and that kind of thing, to try to get the most out of it. It's gratifying and it's incredibly frustrating because you can see the need. And the problem that you have is these programs are always underfunded. The turnover is horrific. And then you just add COVID on top of it, you have a real mess. I don't know how cohesive that presentation was, but that's flying without a net here. So my understanding is you guys stop at 7 o'clock. So
thank you.
I can go on and on and on.
No, I think it's also, it gives us a good time, an opportunity to ask questions too, because I think, when I approached Frank about finding a speaker on, working with maybe people with disabilities, or just, how we can also as a club be more inclusive, because there's certain things I know I go around in life not thinking about or having to think about, because I am able-bodied or because I'm able to, interact with tech the way I do. And I think, it's like that extra level of thinking and care. Like if you're going to have guests over, like you kind of want to make sure everyone's comfortable. And I think that there's thought that was put into someone's presence. And I think that's kind of where I kind of wanted to see how you kind of became that advocate. And also just, like, I think you kind of spelled it out. It's not people with disabilities don't necessarily need extra compassion so much as like, obviously being treated as equals.
Well, part of it, if you look at it, and I think the history is important. I think a lot of folks, if you don't understand how we got here, it's kind of hard to understand what's going on. But we go back to literally in my father's and grandfather's day, and we come from a very strong religious background and that kind. It was you were there to do basically God's work. There's nothing wrong with doing God's work, okay, but it was really for the less fortunate and that sort of thing, and that was kind of the mindset, and that mindset is really prevalent. The real move for folks with disabilities, just like any minority, is really, we will have reached where we should be, where people are just treated like people, whatever they are. But they're kind of the invisible population. I mean, I get this all the time. I get a lot of injury cases where you have somebody who, a lot of times it's young men doing stupid things, right? Like, don't jump off that bridge if you don't know how deep it is and that kind of thing. I work with a lot of families, and I hear this every time. We'll work through the whole thing. It's gonna, maybe they're going to get a settlement or something, but now we're trying to work through the system. And every parent will say, I had no idea basically how screwed up this thing is. A lot of us has this mindset that there's a lot of people just sitting around living off the taxpayer, watching Ellen and just having a great time and that kind of thing. And that's just not how it rolls. There's a lot of people with a lot of needs out there, and providing quality, services and that kind of thing. That's something that, I think we as a community have to take ownership of. And, but yeah, it's like Ed said, it's, we're all temporarily abled, and the disability community does not discriminate. It will accept any one of us at any time, and that was one of my least favorite riffs of his, but it's true,
Let me ask a question, Mr. Dale.
Yes.
So currently you're involved in like trust and trust administration. I know the Golden State Pooled Special Needs Trust is your baby, if you will, and that's management of resources.
Right.
And so this goes to a two-part question. One is, how can we make that management and oversight more efficient and less costly? If you have any thoughts, one. Two is, what do you think is the low-hanging fruit in getting resources to these individuals? And then three is, while I'd like to sit around and watch Ellen and drink beers, ultimately work's validating and important. How do you see potentially making our disabled citizens more productive and valuable?
Okay, well, that almost sounds like a positive setup. So if I have this correct, although I have a short attention span, so you're going to help me out.
No, one. Okay, so simple. One was just efficiency in the oversight. As you know, I'm part of that oversight system, and it's crazy expensive. Two is how do we maximize the resources for these individuals? Money doesn't solve problems, but it makes it a lot easier. It's the lubricant for a lot of things.
Right.
And then three is, how do we give people the dignity of being productive?
So a couple of things. One is, I do donate a lot of time. I'm on the board of the Arc of California here, and I'm on a number of other boards. I actually have a deal with my wife. I'm only on 3 boards at a time, and as I rotate off of one, I picked the short straw because I am the only probate attorney that's involved in a certain part of the advocacy community. And of all the damn things, Britney Spears, and I'm sick of Britney Spears, but apparently Britney Spears and I are going to have a relationship of some sort at a distance, is become a catalyst for a discussion about what are we going to do. And for good or bad, it's shown a light on some problems. For instance, and I'm just going to express my opinion, there's a lot of these things where, quite frankly, the courts have become the social service system, which I don't think is the most efficient system out there. It's the system we have, it's the laws we have, it's the tradition we have, and that sort of thing. But the part, part of it is there's a lot of things that, and once again, I'm not saying we should go back to state hospitals, but these are the things that social workers and, and care managers, when they had such things, used to do in determining what's necessary and how things are going to do. And that system has kind of collapsed and it's getting rebuilt.
Can I interrupt one thing? Because that's an interesting thought.
New systems.
Can I interrupt one thing? It's an interesting thought because I think you're right that the courts end up in a lot of case management decisions, and God knows they're not an expert in that. And so
Right.
Are you suggesting some sort of like administrative oversight, not necessarily legal oversight?
I think we need to look at accountable systems here, but I think we need to look at new systems and, quite frankly, use the courts as the place of last resort. The courts are always going to have an involvement because, we're dealing with people's civil rights. And, once again, that's something that was delegated away 50 years ago. And that wasn't a good idea, so, but on the other hand, there needs to be, as much as I detest what's going on about the attention with Britney Spears, it is shining a light, not just on the court systems and that kind of thing, but delivery of services. And it's causing people to question things and that sort of thing. And I think it's time to question things because there's a lot going on. Ruben, you mentioned low-hanging fruit.
Yeah.
There are programs that I think are absolute disasters, and there are programs that have worked out well and are cost effective. If we go back to the theme here of getting people what they need, there's always a cost to it. Of course there is. There's oversight, there needs to be accountability and that kind of thing. And I have to tell you, I see a lot of waste in that sort of thing. And to me, those resources are precious. But, for instance, we go back to our regional center system. There's programs called independent living and supported living services that do an outstanding job for very little money. And we're actually involved in a program to tap into those programs and hopefully be able to get them some non-governmental funds, because a lot of the issues with many people with disabilities is there's lots of folks with disabilities that absolutely can run their lives. They don't need any help. They wouldn't appreciate it and that sort of thing. Then there's a lot of the folks that I work with that are challenged, and they wouldn't be able to get food on the table if there wasn't somebody who would figure out how to do it. They wouldn't be able to do all sorts of things. And, providing those services and overseeing those services is something that, once again, I think the low-hanging fruit, quite frankly, is not just focusing on the things that don't work, but the things that do work. And the other one is valuing the people that do the work. You go back to me. I worked as a psych tech. I worked with very difficult people and that sort of thing. I think when you work with the disability community, it makes you a better lawyer. It makes you a better, whatever you're doing. If you can work with this population here and do a good job, you're going to learn skills you can take to other places. So I think the other thing with it is to better value the folks who do this work and really try to encourage folks to get into this sort of work and maybe even look at stipends and things like that, because not only is it the value of taking care of the person with the disability, the task that needs to be done, it makes people better citizens. Okay. And I would think with Rotary, that's not a hard sell. Okay. Here, Ruben, I told you I have a short attention span.
And the last one was dignity of productivity.
Yeah. And I think, once again, I think we're moving in that direction, but there's a lot of work to go on that, because one of the things is inclusion, which is, and when I worked at Dredif, I worked on a very famous case called the Rachel Holland case here, where I was just a law clerk. Once again, Forrest Gump. I wasn't the lead attorney on that by any means, but going back to that, the huge resistance in those series of cases to not having disabled folks in classrooms, for instance, because it would like taint the whole process and make it just horrible for my non-disabled loved one, which, by the way, I think the same argument was used for race here. After you got through all the problems, the value of having Rachel in the classroom is valuable, not just for Rachel, but, you know, once again, it's valuable for the class itself, because how are they going to relate to people with disabilities as people if they're basically, you know, kept at a distance, you know, and you just don't get the opportunity to do that. You know, once again, this is something good. It's painful here. It's not easy, you know, civil rights is never easy. If it was, we wouldn't have issues here, but inclusion and that kind of thing, accessibility. And then when it does actually come in the other area that, you know, I and a number of people, and there's a lot of activity in the Bay Area going on this, is people with disabilities not having to be dependent on government benefits and being able to earn money themselves and be productive parts of society. Some of the problems with this is that our services are based on a welfare-based service. So I'll give you an example. For a lot of folks with severe disabilities, if you're quadriplegic, you need somebody who's going to get you out of bed and do all the things you have to do and that sort of thing. And if you don't have the money to pay for that, and believe me, most people on salaries, they're not going to be able to cover that. There's a program called IHSS that does that. Now, the problem is if there's all sorts of workarounds, and you can have clever attorneys like me who can push it to the envelope, but there's a thing called the cliff where you can only earn so much money. And once you earn anything more than that, you lose the in-home support services. Now you can't get out of bed. And so it's called the cliff. It's called, you know, trying to jump the cliff so you can get to the point that you can afford to have just the basic services you need just to get out of bed and get yourself fed. We see, once again, I think with the light of day on these things and people looking at this, our system is an antiquated system, and it's time to make that change and look at people with disabilities as something other than objects that need to be taken care of, but as human beings, you know, and for them to be able to take away the barriers, such as only being able to earn so much to be able to jump that cliff. Does that make sense? I think there's hope. I tend to be a pessimist, which kind of works for me here, but you know, there are good things that happen.
Frank, you had a question?
I'll be really brief because I know Brad and I know we're at the end of our time. Two things. One, I just want to acknowledge, as you guys, some of you know, rather, we have a daughter who's now 25 years old, and she is on that severely disabled side of the spectrum, and she does require round-the-clock care. But one thing, or a few things. One, she loves going to the Ed Roberts Center. That is one of the highlights of her day, to be able to hang out with her friends. The other thing too, the system does have some serious drawbacks. We've experienced them. I have my own personal opinion about them, and I'd love to, you know, maybe over a couple of beers, share them. I'm also on the board of the East Bay Regional Center, so I'm getting a different purview of the system from that side as well, which it's been an education, just from that side of it, to see it from that perspective. So I appreciate some of the points that you're making, Steve, and echo many of them because we've lived them. We're continue to live them. I mean, she's a young African-American woman who is severely disabled. So what does that say in terms of, you know, some of the challenges she's going to have to, you know, navigate throughout the rest of her life? So that's it.
Well, the other issue too with this is historically, folks with severe developmental disabilities didn't live that long, kind of resolved the problem. Well, today they are. And so the issue you have, and Frank, you and I deal with this, you know, when we're planning for somebody, I always like to talk about this mythical girl named Kathy, who, let's say she has cerebral palsy, but otherwise is probably going to have a normal lifespan. And let's say you put everything together, and let's say the parents do pass away, and wherever they funded it with life insurance, now the trust goes into administration. If she's 17 years old, actually, she's supposed to live until 87, 70 years. I mean, imagine the challenges of providing for somebody for 70 years. You know, I've been watching the system for 50 years and have seen monumental changes. We have no idea what's going to happen in the future, good or bad. And if you look at kind of the two worlds, developmental disabilities and mental health, here, once again, in the early days, all the money was in mental health. They poured tons of money, tons of programs, halfway houses, everything under the sun. Those are all gone. It's inconceivable that would happen with developmental disabilities, but it's not unprecedented. Texas dismantled their entire program here. And if, you know, once again, if we're not vigilant, if we're not aware, if we're not constantly advocating, we're going to end up with a mental health system like we have here, which really desperately needs reform. And we need to value it as people. I mean, that's the problem, is I don't think we value it as people here. It's a, you know, it's a nuisance, you know, it's a dirty thing, you know, but it's not. These are people.
Brad, did you have a question?
I did, and we're short on time, so maybe if there's a short answer to it. I'm interested, given your background and perspective, particularly that of an attorney in this process, the process for ADA enforcement. Having watched this twice as a property owner, completely agree and understand that everything should have a standard and be held to that to have access. But the process seems to be built in with a natural bias, and that is, people will come in and observe a deficiency, and before you know anything, you're being sued. And the majority of your assets doesn't go necessarily to fix the problem, it goes into the legal fees. And I'm curious of your opinion if that is a deficiency, because I think the courts are the one, ultimately it was built to have the courts settle this. And I think the courts have to enforce the law, but it doesn't seem to be unreasonable that there would be a period of opportunity to fix the problems, that if in fact that they didn't clear that period of opportunity, and it would be reasonable, both short enough and long enough, that in fact they would be able to be enforced the law. But having gone through that episode twice and now trying to help a couple of people who just bought into a business, didn't know they should be measuring things, and now are at risk of losing their business because they can't afford the lawsuit. And the attorney for the plaintiffs are not really friendly at settling. They kind of seem like they want to let it drag on. It seems like the system isn't helping the process, which is to fix the access. What's your outlook on having a period of time where you can solve it?
Two things real quick. And by the way, I'm a business owner. I bought a house. I bought my own building. I will tell you, every headache was the ADA. It was like payback time. Okay, there you go. But here's a couple things to consider. Okay, and I think part of what you say has some validity. Some of it, quite frankly, I think there's a systemic problem. The original law, when it was put in place, that was what I was involved with Dredith, was that they knew that with the enforcement of the law, the Attorney General was not going to be enforcing building code laws. So they set this up specifically. In fact, these were the classes that Dredith was teaching, that they were going to make private attorneys private attorney generals, and basically that there would be a private right to action. And what they were basically doing is training people how to bring lawsuits if necessary. Now, early on when it was done here, and by the way, the law's only been on the books for 35 years. I mean, so it's not like a lot of complexity. Yeah, maybe that may be not top of mind when you buy a business and that kind of thing, but the objective was to make the state of California accessible here. And by design, it was set up to do exactly what it's doing. I think the problem has been along the line is that there have been some vexed litigators here with this. And it's kind of sad because I think there needs to be more awareness of accessibility issues and that kind of thing. The whole thing about not aware that the law existed. The laws have been around for a long time and that sort of thing, but there needs to be something. I mean, the objective is to make the community accessible, not necessarily to shake down the business owner. The thing that I really feel bad about is that the move has gone the other direction, making the ADA attorney the villain, here. And there are a couple of players, one specifically out of San Diego, who I think is actually doing this service here, which is really sad because the vast majority of folks that are involved in this, once again, they're looking at making the place accessible. And believe me, it was kind of comic when I wanted to make some modifications to my building and I couldn't do it because of the ADA. So it was, I feel the pain, and like every headache was the ADA. But civil rights, it's sometimes it's a little on the messy side.
Well, I get that, and I don't debate that at all. But I guess my question was being able to allow a period of cure before the nature of I have to pay $10,000 or $15,000 to an attorney, which has nothing to do with making my building better, and particularly for those that are really trying to make the ends meet. And a lot of these stories have come out more recently, and I've seen them go through. What is your thought about a period of cure? And if that isn't enforced, then the filing goes through.
I think that kind of thing would make more sense, but I think you even need to go even further. I think in some ways, it's like a lot of things with disability. It's like a lot of things with a lot of inequities. Really, the right answer would be to shine the light of day on it, because really it's been so politicized at this point that we've kind of lost the whole point, which is we're talking about accessibility. You're talking about a rational way of accessibility. So the old system, because what they're doing, it was designed to do specifically what it's doing. We're in a different period now, and I think there should still be a private right to enforcement and that sort of thing, but there needs to be looked at. But I think there's a lot of things in the disability community that could really use the light of day. You even go back to the damn Britney Spears thing, which once again, there's a lot of like real cuckoo things going on. But if you boil it down, no matter where you sit, there's a problem, right? And there's got to be a different way. I'm sorry that she's, and I'm not supposed to use the word poster child. I'm sorry, she's the poster child for it. But we as citizens here for our community, we need to look at what are the systems for delivery of programs? What is our responsibility as business owners to the disability community? What is, all of these things, and also what's the value of that community, and even here's a harder one, and this is, I know as a Northern California liberal, sometimes people are surprised to hear me say this, but Frank, let me point out to you, Frank, you have a child with a disability who's going to need assistance for the rest of their life. Whose responsibility is that, right? And, and I think it's one of those things that we kind of skirt around sometimes here. And I think that we need to go back and start answering those questions. And the other part of that is, if we're going to really rely more on families to step up to the plate, we should be giving them incentives. The law is full of disincentives that if you act, the worst of them is if you feed your child with a disability, they'll actually reduce their public benefits. If you provide them with housing, in some situations, they'll actually reduce their benefits. Isn't that nuts? I mean, don't you think we should give them a thank you or a tax deduction or something? But we don't, because, we don't go back to the basic question. Whose damn responsibility is it? And with that, how are we going to get these things taken care of? And, my personal feeling is it's a shared responsibility. And what can we do rationally to assist these folks? And also, they actually have a value. They're not just a burden.
Well,
It's
thank
the
you,
most
Brandon.
amazing thing.
Yeah, and one final comment is that I grew to love the ADA when I had twins in a stroller, because then I had ramps everywhere. And Dan, you'll appreciate that. And also after I had my knee surgery, when I was limping around for a couple months, having those grab bars. So it's kind of like what you said, Steve, that we're all going to be disabled at some point. Dan, you will soon be disabled with a child, and you will love the ADA too, because you can stroll your up anywhere you need to go. And it's really, I think, it's not about disabled people, it's about all of us, that at various times in our lives, we need access to certain places. And unfortunately, the law can be black and white, like the aisle's got to be 36 inches and not 34 inches or whatever that is. Yeah, exactly. But there's got to be some standards so we know that people are performing and it's not just junk. But I think your comments appreciated, Brad. One final comment. I cannot comment upon pending legal matters, but I do think that Britney Spears does shine a light on bad decisions. I'll say that. And maybe not from the judge even, but from other parties involved. But that's the problem when you talked about the courts being this social worker oversight of what people are managing someone's cares. They're not designed for that. And anyway,
it does get a little on the expensive side.
Yeah, I'll just nod my head and agree. And then finally, Steve, my low-hanging fruit, I think, is Family Code Section 3910. That parents have an ongoing duty of support for children, regardless of age. And I don't think enough disabled individuals take advantage of that.
I don't disagree with you. And that just 3910 just has to do with in California, if your child is unable to provide for themselves because of a disability, support is lifelong.
Yeah, and that can affect inheritance, for example, that maybe it's not equal to all the kids.
Yeah.
Maybe the disabled kid gets more.
Yeah, talking about opening a can of worms, but the thing about it is these are difficult decisions and somebody needs to do it, and maybe this is the time, and God help us if it's Britney Spears who actually is the catalyst, but if it is, so be it,
Wow, we covered so much, and I had more questions, but I want to end this, and maybe we can follow up and respect your time and everyone else's time, but maybe I can follow up with a couple more. But Stephen, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Well, thank you for having me.
As a thank you for your time, we as a club are donating some vaccines in your name.
Ooh.
What kind of vaccines? Polio vaccines. It's been longer than 30 years, as I was told at our last live meeting, but Rotary as an organization has been working to eradicate polio, and now it's only endemic in Afghanistan and Pakistan, and that's our Jolene in the photo administering a polio vaccine through a drop, right?
Well, being that I'm a Ed Roberts groupie who, got polio at a young age, that is very appropriate. So thank you very much. I'm sure Ed would thank you too.
Yes, thank you. And to our guests, I hope you'll join us at a live function soon. You can I think I've added you to our newsletter already, maybe. If you didn't get today's link, let me know. But we are pretty social, and I'll check our website to see what we're up to next. That's probably the best, most accurate, up-to-date thing. But thank you, everyone. I really appreciate this discussion. I feel like we could have gone longer, but out of respect to everyone's time and, tummies, someone must be getting dinner. I appreciate it. And have a good night, and we'll see you soon.
Rotary.